So practice writing questions. It is really, really important. Confucius said, the man who asks a question is a fool for a minute, but the man who does not ask is a fool for life. And that resonates with me because every time I ask a question, I kind of feel silly. Right? As a younger academic, even in a lecture theatre, if I was asking a question, it took a bit of courage because, you know, you're making yourself vulnerable to, you know, some teasing from your peers or asking a silly question. But actually, it is the way to get knowledge. And a more serious quote that I quite like is that it's easier to judge the mind of a man by his questions rather than his answers. So somebody who thinks a lot and thinks about thinking, which is metacognition, and somebody who goes deep will have very interesting questions. And so as a PhD researcher, asking questions, as I keep saying this, is the secret to contributing to knowledge and to having a really good thesis and also a career in academia. Of course, the next thing that came to mind at maybe 2 a.m. last night was just to understand the limitations of your research. Every research paper should have a limitation section, and you should understand the limitations generally in science. Science doesn't really prove anything. You know, if you engage with the literature on the philosophy of science, you'll realize that science is all about falsifying ideas or hypotheses. And you know, the quote from Einstein here is a perfect example, because no amount of experimentation can ever prove me right. A single experiment can prove me wrong. And that's why a lot of experiments are set up to falsify your hypothesis. And that's just the setup for hypothesis testing more generally. And that is generally accepted to be the scientific method. There is lots of limitations to science more generally, as I say, and the two basic tools that people use in science is induction and deduction. Induction is the tool where you make lots of observations. You go out and observe, let's say 100 people, or you collect data from 100 subjects. And from that data, then you induct a general rule or theory. Anybody who does machine learning in this group, machine learning is itself an inductive method, because you're taking lots of examples, putting it into a machine learning algorithm, and hoping that the machine learning algorithm will induct a general rule or general set of rules. But there are problems with that, because for example, if you go out and look at you know, let's say 2,000 swans in your area, they all happen, let's say, to be white. Then you induct that all swans are white. That's your inducted theory. But if you go to Australia or some other continent, you might come across a black swan, and in fact there are black swans. So there's always a limitation to how you do your research and to what research methods you use. And Bertrand Russell gives a very simple example of the problem of induction, and he calls it the inductivist turkey. And he tells it through a story which is written on the screen here, which is quite interesting. So let's say there is a turkey. On the first morning at the turkey farm, he was fed at 9 a.m. But being a good inductivist, he didn't jump to conclusions. He waited until he collected a large number of samples or observations, and he found that he was fed at 9 a.m. almost every morning, and he took observations from Wednesdays and Thursdays and took random days to make his observations. And each day he added another observation to his list. Finally, he was satisfied that he had collected enough data to inductively infer that I am always fed at 9 a.m. However, on the morning of Christmas, he was not fed, but instead had his throat cut. So there's always a problem with induction. And the basic assumption of induction is that the future is similar to the past, which is obviously not always true, as illustrated through this story. So the third observation or maxim that I wanted to talk about is understanding the bias in your research and your own biases. And you can write a whole book on this. The obvious one that we all know about is researcher bias and confirmation bias. That is, if you have an idea or a hypothesis, you might only search for evidence to support that hypothesis, and you'll just agree with everything you read and never actually read the stuff that contradicts your hypothesis. So understand the bias in the experimental design as well. If you had a hypothesis that males were generally taller than females, and if you collected data from a female basketball team versus the heights of males from a soccer team, you might conclude that females are actually taller, but obviously that's a complete biased study because there's no randomization and there's a confounder because you're working with a female basketball team. That's a very simple example, but there are so many biases and cognitive biases in research, and I could really go on and talk a lot about this, but you can read online about the different types of cognitive biases that you can have. So number 4, this is something I thought about before. Know the landscape before deciding where to plant a tree. And this is something that just came out of me because somebody had criticized me and tried to, force me to focus on one area. I was a very young, I maybe just finished my PhD, and this was my response to the person that said this to me, to focus. But for me at that time, I was trying to know the landscape before I decided to plant the tree. And you've all heard of the saying, you can't see the wood for the trees. Now, this is a pretty old, let me see if I can go back. This is a pretty ancient saying. I think it originates in Bath. The word wood here simply means forest. It doesn't mean actual wood. It means forest. So today's rendition should be, you can't see the forest for the trees. And this is a saying because some people are so focused on the details that they can't see what's around them. They miss the point. And this is kind of relevant to how we learn, and the best way to learn is to move from what psychologists call a focused learning and diffuse learning. Focused learning is when you're focusing on the problem and you're doing calculations, you're working out relationships on pen and paper, and then diffuse learning is taking a step back and going for a walk or having, for example, Thomas Edison used to schedule micro naps during the day. He used to have little naps, 20-minute naps, because sleeping and going for a walk, your unconscious activity helps to create new connections. So when you're focused on something, you're learning. Yes, you're directly learning, but it's only when you walk away from focused learning that you start to make new neural connections and connections with your other prior knowledge and existing knowledge. And so it's good to move from the detail to the general, in a oscillating way. So number 5, and by the way, I do have lots of other notes around these slides, and I haven't really mentioned much of them, but I'm trying to save time. Number 5, don't be afraid to be a polymath. Again, this comes back to, you'll find that some PhD theses are vertical, that is, they're very deep on one subject, and you can find a PhD theses that are horizontal, that they touch on different subjects. And there's no right or wrong to that. But if you feel that you have lots of interests, then don't be afraid to be a polymath. You've heard of the quote that people often use, a jack of all trades and a master of none. This is a quote by Benjamin Franklin. But actually the original quote was not that. The original quote, I believe, was a jack of all trades and a master of one, because it was very important to have to be eclectic across many fields, but yet try and master at least one or two of those. Some people do change this quote to a jack of all trades and a master of some, which is probably even better. And this is the T approach, where the top of the T is that you're transcending across many disciplines, and you're learning across disciplines, but maybe one or two of those disciplines you're going deep, and that's the T model for learning. And you know, if anybody ever criticizes you for being a polymath, there has been a study, and they have found that 15 out of the 20 significant inventions were by polymaths, who are listed here, from Newton to Aristotle, Kepler, Laplace, Faraday, and Maxwell, and so on. They were all polymaths, apparently. So there is a benefit to transcending across different disciplines, and any, I guess, professor of innovation will tell you that most innovations happen when two disciplines come together, or when you take one idea from one domain and another idea from another domain and merge them and marry them. That's normally when innovations happen. Again, I was trying to find lots of quotes for this little presentation. This is one that I thought was quite good. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And we all know that with the age of automation and AI appearing, people are fearing job losses, and people don't want to retrain. And you know, in some of my UX research, I have come across this baby duck syndrome. That is, that some people don't want to accept better technology because they're so familiar with the technology they have. That's why you even have people, you might have somebody who loves the Nokia 310, and it actually is quite usable. But if you give them something better, even something more intuitive, I mean, touchscreens are generally more intuitive. Children can use them. They don't accept them because of familiarity, and it's difficult to change behavior and to adopt new systems. But it's an important skill to be able to be open to learn and unlearn and relearn. And the next point is really just, it's for a personal point that I'm making, is that I went out for a walk recently thinking about this talk, and I was thinking about the word fulfillment and what it really means to be fulfilled. And I was trying to identify moments in my own life where I felt fulfilled. This is pretty deep, I realized. But I realized it was learning. Learning is something I enjoy. It is one moment during my day that when I feel fulfilled. And there is that, you might have read some articles about this 5-hour rule. That is, that some celebrities like like Bill Gates and Barack Obama and so on, they've done some research, and they have this 5-hour rule. That is, if you're not devoting 5 hours to learning each week, you're being irresponsible. But regardless of that, I believe that you really need to love learning to have a career in academia, an interesting career, that is. And the fact that you're all doing PhDs and so on would indicate that you do enjoy learning. So that's good. Now, learning, what I tried to do last night, and this was at 2 a.m. Because I do cram things. This is how I do things in life. I tried to understand what I was reading, what books I'm reading, to try and understand what I like learning about. And that's a really nice exercise to do. If you look around your room and look at the books that you've read recently, and some of the books that you've read a while ago but have inspired you, put them in a PowerPoint slide and list the topics. And then you really get to understand yourself. you really get to understand your own interests, because sometimes it's difficult to understand yourself. So I did this last night, and it's not all the books, but I was kind of disappointed that I'm not reading more, actually. I'm a pretty slow reader. So as you can see on the slide, you know, I've recently read some books in statistics. One is an old book by Darrell Huff, How to Lie with Statistics, which is very nice. It's a very short book. And basically, it's just the fact that you can actually visualize data in different ways to tell different stories. In other words, to tell lies. For example, the simple example is if you change the y-axis of a time series or a line graph, you know, you can show a steeper trend than there really is. For example, if you remove outliers from certain graphs, you can tell a different story. And you've all heard of things like p-hacking and other behaviors that some people can do to manipulate data, which is you know, evil research. You know, you want to maintain research integrity and don't ever want to engage with those activities, but you can engage with some of those things without knowing it. So it's important to read books on statistics, and I think regardless if you're doing HCI research or biomedical research, statistics is very important to science generally. I looked at the machine learning books that I've been reading recently. Again, networks is quite difficult if you want to understand them. Partial derivatives and gradient descent are all very difficult concepts for me because I'm not a mathematician. So I've been reading some of that. I read a book called The Master Algorithm by Pedro Domingos, which is excellent. I recommend that all computing scientists should read that book. It gives a really nice overview of the different machine learning algorithms. And the book is quite nice because in physics, for example, people are searching for a unified theory of physics, you know, because the quantum and the big don't really, you know, they don't harmonize their ideas that well. Well, this book is about the quest for a unified theory of machine learning. That is, will we ever discover one algorithm that solves all solutions? And there are some reasons why that might never be found, like the no free lunch theorem, which is the fact that we have seen in research that no one algorithm has been the best algorithm for all problems. Despite what you hear about deep learning, by the way, it's not always the best solution for all problems. I just finished the book by Ray Kurzweil, How to Create a Mind. Very technical book. Really enjoyed it. But you can really see that I'm interested in AI. You can really see that I'm interested in machine learning. Some of the UX books I read, the one by Jeff Sorrow, Quantifying the User Experience. It's, you know, you might say it's controversial in the sense that can we really quantify something that's qualitative? That can you quantify something that is, you know, a construct like user experience? It's kind of touchy-feely. But it's a really nice statistics book on the different, you know, you've heard things like SUS and different types of things like that. It's quite good. Emotional Design, it was a book that I really enjoyed by Don Norman about the role of emotions. So you can see that I'm interested in UX. You can see that I'm interested in people. I think everybody, absolutely everybody should read that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. By the way, I'm not interested in manipulating people, by the way. The book gives you insight into human beings, which can be useful. Cognitive science books, Hooked is a very good book that I read. It talks about the neuroscience of being addicted to technology. You know, we live in an era of people being addicted to Instagram or Facebook. And this book talks about the kind of dopamine hits that people get, and also talks about the evil by design in technology today, that kind of unapologetically try to get people hooked or addicted. Like the endless scroll that we have on Facebook and Instagram, we never get closure with the interaction. The like button, we get a hit from social recognition and all sorts. And one of the books that really helped me as well was the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's a really nice book that discusses the dual process theory of cognition. That is the fact that humans have two ways of thinking: the system one thinking or fast thinking, how people are classified objects in a room. You know, I know that I'm looking at a screen. I don't have to think hard about that. And then system two, which is difficult logical thinking, reasoning, calculations, doing arithmetic. But that book also outlines the whole series of cognitive biases that we have as humans, like anchoring. You know, if you hear about a plane crash last week, you know, you're a bit nervous getting on a plane this week. But even though statistically that, you know, it's a very low probability, if there was a terrorist attack in a city a few months back, we're not likely to go to that city, even though it's very unlikely that it will happen again. So there's loads of cognitive biases that Daniel Kahneman goes through, and that would be really useful to know about. I'll not keep going on with this slide, but it was just quite reflective for me last night to look at the topics that I'm naturally interested in. And this is a good exercise that I recommend you do. Okay. Number 7, research something you're naturally interested in. This resonated with me because at a conference, again, a younger PhD student, I was doing an eye tracking experiment, and one of the subjects, he was a pretty senior consultant cardiologist. He might have been retired at this stage, and he was well into his 70s. He said to me, his advice to me was to do something difficult. Now, I was thinking about that, and I had been thinking about it. And for me, I don't want to labor this too much, but for me, what he really meant is that I should look into how we can take ECGs. An ECG is a recording of the electrical signal of the heart. But what he was really asking me to do, can I take the signals recorded on the body surface and create a mathematical model to infer what the electrical signals would look like on the heart surface? That's a really hard problem in the field that I was in at that time, but I wasn't interested. I mean, I don't even think I had the ability to contribute anything to that field, but that's what he was interested in, and he wanted me to do something difficult. And I know I disagree with that statement. I don't think it is. It's not about doing something difficult. It's about doing something you're naturally interested in. And just very quickly, last night, I wrote a few things out that I thought would articulate your ideal research project. I think your ideal research project should be something that you're excited about. It might be out of your control right now, but once you get into academia and you progress, you will have the autonomy to do what you want to do. So pick something you're excited about. But not only that, it has to be something it has to be a research question worth answering. And you have to have the ability, which is maybe something I don't want to labor on, but you have to be excited about it, and it has to be worth asking the question. And I think the first one, which is why I put it in bigger font, being excited about it is the most important thing. It's really difficult to make a contribution to something if you're not passionate about it. I think that's the point here. And with every student now that we have, myself and my colleague, you know, it was actually his idea to ensure that every student has a implications for policy and practice section in the discussion. So within the discussion, they have an implications for policy and practice, and that really kind of answers the so what of the research. What's the point? What will it inform? There's no point in doing research if it's not going to promise anything beyond that. So number 8, on reflecting on my own journey, everyone has something to teach you, and you need to learn to spit out the bones. You need to treat every human being, everybody you meet, as somebody you can engage with. You can teach them something, but they can certainly teach you something. Never be in the position where you're arrogant and think that this person has nothing to teach you. They absolutely do, and it's all to do with the right question. If you can figure out the right question to ask that person, you will learn a lot from them. That's been my own experience. Number 9, we're getting there. I said I had 12. Number 9, benchmark yourself against yourself yesterday. There's no point in comparing yourself to your peers. Every PhD is completely unique, and you as a person are completely unique. Nobody has went on your journey. So don't compare yourself with your peers. Compare yourself to yourself yesterday. I found this quote a couple of hours ago. Anyone who isn't embarrassed of who they were last year probably isn't learning enough. When I think of my thesis, I am embarrassed. I don't hold it in huge regard. It was okay. If I read papers that I had written 10 years ago, I don't think they're any good. So it's okay to be like that. And if you feel like that, it means that you're on the journey and you're progressing in the right direction. I remember having a touch of imposter syndrome, which you might have heard of before. Imposter syndrome is really, despite your achievements, you feel unworthy. You feel you're conning somebody. You're waiting on somebody catching you out. You know what? Who let me into this PhD kind of thing. And I came across this quote at that time, which is, "Do what you can with what you have, where you are," and that's all you can do. You know, if you have supervisors that maybe aren't experts in the field that you're working in, or if you don't have the lab equipment that you wish you had, do what you can with what you have, where you are, and that's all you can do. And that, for some reason, that really helped me through that period, and it helped me go on that journey. Okay, number 10, don't be too precious. Work with others and share your ideas. You will find a mixture of people that are hyper precious about their ideas or software, and then you'll find people that aren't. I always tried to keep the mentality of never being precious. Talk to everybody, share my ideas. I co-author lots of papers with lots of people, and what I realized is that when you sow lots of seed, you reap a bigger harvest, and you have more interesting outputs and more interesting conversations. So don't be precious with your ideas, because if you're precious, you'll bury them, and not much will come of them. And I always find that your idea will be a better idea through a conversation. Okay, number 11, think for yourself. Don't be afraid to define new concepts, neologisms, and theories. Neologisms is just a word that simply means coming up with new words or concepts. Don't be afraid of doing that. I think I came across this before where I had an idea for a new concept, and somebody asked me, but does that concept or word appear in the literature? And I realized that it didn't. And the advice back to me was, well, then we can't use it. Everything originates from somewhere. And I think building up the confidence to new frameworks and new theories and concepts is really important, because that's where a lot of the intellectual thought comes from, is when you're trying to come up with something new. Last one. Manage yourself for progress. My favorite quote that I've been abusing over the last year has been, "Perfection is the enemy of progress." And as I said, this maxim isn't always true, because good is the enemy of great. good is the enemy of the great. But perfection often is the enemy of progress, where if you perfect something that's fairly trivial, you will spend a lot of time on it, and that will affect your overall progress on working on things that are more important. What do I mean? Well, I try to keep this, and I'm not adhering to it myself, so I'm kind of preaching to myself here, but I try to keep this Eisenhower matrix in my mind. And the Eisenhower matrix is a matrix of tasks. It's a matrix where you can put your tasks into. Basically, it's a matrix between how important the task is and how urgent a task is. And you can see quadrant number 1, that's the urgent and important tasks. And we all do those. That is, we have a critical email from our line manager. It's urgent and it's very important, and we do those. Then we have quadrant 3. If you look at quadrant 3, we have urgent tasks, but they're not very important. You know, the best thing to do is to delegate those, but a lot of us do them because they're urgent, right? Anything that's urgent, we kind of jump to. But the quadrant that I want to highlight, which is the quadrant that successful people focus on, is the not urgent but important quadrant. It's not urgent, so we don't jump to it, but it's very important. And that's the quadrant of tasks that we often ignore. But for CEOs and very successful people, they will focus on that quadrant, and they will ignore tasks very often from the other quadrants. They may not reply to your email. They may take a long time to reply to a trivial email, but they're focusing on something much more important. And for academics, that could be the EPSRC proposal that we all should be working on, because it's not urgent, but it's important. And so I try to keep that Eisenhower matrix in my mind. I still haven't mastered it. I still jump to everything else, and that still is the quadrant that I ignore, but I shouldn't. So learn to be resilient. I think all the academics around the table know this. Resilience is really, really important. Lots of people will ask you questions. I came up with this proverb recently: any fool can ask a question that a wise man can't answer. So, you know, if you get difficult questions, don't stress about it. Don't worry about it. As I said, any fool can ask a question that a wise man can't answer. But do learn to be resilient, because academia is about critical thinking and critiquing each other, and you can get difficult peer reviews, as you all know by this stage. Coming towards the end, be kind, bring positivity, stay humble, and don't be stubborn. None of us know that much. I realized through my journey that the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And the more disciplines that you start to engage with, you really do feel very small, and you really do feel ignorant of a lot of knowledge. And you realize how little you know. And just as a kind of something to throw in, beware of the Dunning-Kruger effect and the imposter syndrome. You can sway between them. The Dunning-Kruger effect is where you know, someone thinks that they know a lot. Well, someone thinks that they know a lot, but in actual fact they don't. To be more specific than that, it can be somebody who is very confident, thinks that they're very intelligent, and thinks that intelligent people aren't intelligent. But the reality is the other way around, you know. And imposter syndrome is the complete opposite, where you feel unworthy despite your achievements in life. And you can actually swing between those, and being in the middle somewhere is the best place to be. That's the nice graph of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where as you progress your knowledge, that is the competence, your confidence can quickly grow, and that's the Mount, called Mount Stupid, because you've learned something for 2 weeks, your confidence is high, and you actually think you understand it all, but in actual fact you don't. So you still continue to learn, and you go into the valley of despair. You go up the slope of enlightenment, and of course, hopefully you get to your destination that actually you're a bit wiser at the end of the journey. So I realized that was kind of, I had never given that presentation before. I prepared it at 12 a.m. last night until 2 a.m. So thanks, Alan.
So I was just noting, I put it into the chat that evidently I've seen this, and you might know better, but I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is worst for experts when they're in a different area. So we've all got to be cautious of it. So anyway, just got some. Does anybody want to ask some questions of Raymond? Thank you very much, first of all. Sorry, I haven't done my class. Yeah, I was just trying to look in the yes, so yeah, we'll ask you to share your slides. So yeah, I was going to ask
Fiona has a question that said to Ray, what was one thing you learned near the end of your PhD you wish you'd known at the beginning, which is a good question.
Yeah. Well, I guess I wish I had have spent 2 weeks reading the philosophy of science and to understand the problems in the philosophy of science, because you start to understand the scientific method, what it is to form a hypothesis, what it is to test it, and also to understand things like the demarcation problem, which is trying to judge what is science and pseudoscience, which is actually a pretty difficult problem. You know, people are talking about it today, you know, the God hypothesis, is it science or is it not? But it can't be really falsified, and people then go to cosmology and talk about the Big Bang theory. Can it be falsified? And so it's a really interesting debate when you go into the philosophy of science. I still don't know a lot about it, but if you look at the history of it, right up until Karl Popper, and you start to read those philosophy of science experts, you really get to understand what is it, you know, the tools you're using to contribute to knowledge. And I don't think, certainly, I don't see a lot of that going on, and certainly in our department. I think every PhD student should be doing a course in the philosophy of science at the very start of their PhD. Yeah, so that's something I wish I had have done at the start of my PhD, which was 2008.
I'm looking at the chat and other questions. So Dan was saying, you know, if you've done your neologism, I mean, if anybody wants to jump up and just shout, so just open, unmute and shout at this point. But he was asking, if you've done your neologism, how do you get it accepted?
Really difficult question, because it is a proper problem. Sorry, my daughter has left a melted ice lolly on my desk. Yeah, it is difficult. I think you provide good sound reasoning for. I mean, there has to be a reason to come up with a new concept or a new word. And if it's really sound, you can convince. You know, I think people listen to rationale and good logic, but it is a problem, because I think a lot of people's default position is, well, it doesn't appear in the literature, therefore, you can't use that. So I'm not really providing an answer as I try and clean up this ice lolly.
So if I can jump in, I would say that it's if it's useful, it'll be accepted. If you've come up with something that other people, that is either simpler than what was there before, or that helps explain something that people hadn't understood, or makes it easier to do something, people will quite happily adopt it. If it's massively complex, massively esoteric, fantastically specialized, it's going to be a really big uphill battle. But fundamentally, if it's useful, it will get accepted.
So I'll chip in on there as well, because also if you think it is good, and this is true not just of the neologism, but of your work in general, certainly for many, many years, for most of my career, and I still struggle with this, I would think, well, I've published it. You know, there were people who would sort of go around and sort of pigeonhole you and send you emails when you'd written something that was vaguely close to their work. And I would think, big heads. If what you've got is important, then you need to share it. And that's why things like and nowadays things like social media help that. They also help the bad news. But if you've done something important, part of your duty is to share it with others. And so it's not just a matter of passively thinking, it's good, I've published it, people will take it up. You actually have to be quite active about that process. But it is hard connecting into the imposter feeling that, it feels like, oh no, I shouldn't be pushing, shouting my own whatever it is, but actually you do have to ring your own bell sometimes, not for yourself, but if it's important, then you should be doing it.
And to that, it's oftentimes harder for HCI researchers and for a lot of you, because not only do you need to promote it within the HCI field, you need to promote it within the domain in which you're working, which might be health or data analytics or AI or whatever it might be. But you've kind of got two areas in which the different aspects of it need to be talked about. So that can make it even more work to make sure your ideas are out there.
Tom said, how does the ideal research project align to flow?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I would imagine Tom would give a better answer than what I'm going to give, but yes, flow is a really nice framework for gaming and for programming as well. As a computer programmer, I was a web programmer for a few years before I went into a PhD. I was always in the flow. Every time I did some programming, many hours would go by, and I would have got complaints from my sister and my parents back in the day that the computer chair was going around the room at like 4 a.m., but I was completely clueless. So yeah, I think that's what you're asking, Tom. I think if you are doing something you're fascinated about, if you're designing an experiment about something that you're really interested in, you would be completely in the flow, I would imagine. Even when you're writing the ethics application, because you're writing the experimental design for a study that you're fascinated about, I think you would be in the flow. But that's an interesting research question. I don't know how it would compare to playing a game or programming, but that's...
I've got a right to that, but I want to check if anybody else has something first. No? Okay. Now, I was just going to say, because it's part of one thing I experienced, and I was wondering about you, whether you have some things, is that being, certainly if I'm in the midst of writing or coding, that being immersed is important. But also, I find it very critical, the breakdown moments, the moments, which again, we're taught from a design point of view to avoid for our users. But actually, it's the breakdown moments when I'm forced to reflect on things. So it's when the flow stops that I do a different level or a different kind of thinking about my work. And I wonder if that's something that you or anybody else has experienced as well.
Yeah, no, I'm actually, and I'm going to completely agree with you. And it's one of my things I should have sent in for a top tip. My top tip is go for a walk. Actually, we're doing a study. I'm doing a study at the moment with a PhD student on psychogeography and walking with children, and she's showing lots of evidence that walking outside makes you more creative. But I do that, and it's one of the things that people always laugh at me about, is that I always argue because I cycle a lot, and I always argue when I'm cycling, I'm working. So I don't have a problem with leaving my office, going for a 3-hour ride and then coming back. I don't see that as me skiving off. What I'm doing is I'm trying to stop myself from thinking so that I can think properly, so that I can get into a meditative state of flow. and ignore what's going on, because I always find that when I come back, I've got the answer that I'm looking for.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wish I could remember some of the stories, but a lot of the famous books that you would have heard of, and even films and so on, came from people taking a 7-year break, and they came back and wrote like a best-selling book in 3 weeks, because actually their break was that was their content, that was their proper work, and that fits in nicely with the whole theory of diffuse and focused learning. And I do this with books. So when I read a book, it takes me a long time to read a book, and people laugh because maybe it's me, like maybe my eyes strain and I get tired very quickly or whatever. But it's probably also to do with the fact that when I read a book, I'm very focused. I'm in focused learning. But at the end of every other sentence, I go back to diffuse. Do you ever just pause and then start to wonder and think? And then you very quickly make connections between what you just read and what you already know. And that's kind of oscillating between the whole focused and diffuse learning. Anyway, that's just a comment. So it's kind of related to what you said, Alan, about being in the flow and then coming out of the flow. That's how I kind of read a book. I'm in the flow and I come out.
I think one of the important things is just stepping back and just allowing things work, just to sort of sit there untouched for a little bit, maybe a week or so, before you then pick it up again and look at it a little bit more critical. Particularly even if you're writing papers about your PhD work and things like that, you're working up to the deadline, you think you've written something and you haven't, and it's just that opportunity just to sort of have time to, in effect, write what you think you are writing and be extra critical of the work. For my PhD, I remember I was doing it part-time while I was working, and it took me about a year just to do the final edits to it all and everything. And that was because we was going back and looking at it, it was being extra critical because I hadn't read it for about a month, and I'm picking it up and reading it for afresh. And you can then be critical and unpick your work a lot better than if you just sit there, write for an hour, then look at it again, get up the next day, write again, and then just do that routine. Stepping back and then coming back with fresh eyes, like Tom talks about, going for a bike ride and things like that, to look at it. It's important to have time in your PhD studies and things just to have that opportunity to sit back and reflect.
I was going to just, there's 2 sub-skills, which are skills, techniques, anyway, that I think feed into making that possible. The first is the one I think we all find difficult, and there are techniques to help, so I won't go to those, but which is doing something that you know is not the final thing. And that's really hard. It's particularly with writing. And again, there's some tech, I won't do that, but there are techniques to help you do this. But certainly when you write, certainly I find this in word processor even worse. You're trying to write the perfect prose first time. So any techniques can help you to do imperfect things, because then you can go back to them. And the other thing, which is slightly more of a structured thing, is learning, but again, I'm not always good at this, so I haven't learned, but learning how to put something to bed. So whether it's a piece of writing or it's a piece of coding, how you can do something and then put it into that stage where you can forget about it for a while, but when you come back, you don't have to spend 3 days trying to work out what you were on about. And so, trying to find those ways of both doing something that you don't intend to last forever, that's going to be changed, but ways of annotating it so that you can put it aside, but say it's the chapter of your thesis, you've written it, but there may be loose ends, there may be things you're thinking of you haven't quite worked out how to say. Ways of annotating that so that you've got that little package that you can then put aside, worry about some other thing, and then come back to.
If we're planning for nuggets, here's a couple I think that are helpful. The first is that writing is thinking. And you shouldn't write just because you're writing a paper or just because you're writing your PhD. You should kind of write a lot of the time, really. And sometimes you'll use it and sometimes you won't. But if you can write clearly, that means you can think clearly. And that actually, the process of trying to write means that you do have to try and get your thinking in order. So I always encourage my students to write loads and loads and loads. If nothing else, it gives you practice at writing. So when you come to write other things, it's easier. But it almost always gives you a large amount of the content and the other stuff that you can do anyway. And it probably makes what you're doing better in the first place. And the other thing, Fiona talked about procrastination, which is an issue for everybody, and is in fact a research topic of mine at the moment when I can get around to it. But a good way of addressing procrastination is, as Alan said, to kind of do something that's imperfect. So don't try and think of writing your paper or writing the talk, because that you will want to put that off. Just think about jotting down an outline for it or some notes for it. And actually you'll often find when you start, you'll get on and do it anyway. And even if you don't, you know, you've got time to come back to it. And if you don't have time to come back to it, well, at least you've got something there in the first place. So actually aim to do something that is not the final thing, that is not going to be perfect, that are just going to be a few notes. And that often gets you sufficiently going that you'll make some progress. Because managing your time is quite difficult. And this kind of comes back to what Raymond was saying about urgent and important stuff. You've got to focus, you know, doing a PhD, not a vast amount of time, which you've got to do an awful lot of stuff. So you do have to manage your time quite effectively and trying to find ways of giving yourself space to think, giving yourself space to go for your walk or your bike ride, and yet still being productive is really important.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say that I would completely agree that writing is thinking. And just as a thought, I would recommend everybody to write their research questions 10, 15, 20 different ways. Write it from many different perspectives, because articulation is thinking. And the better you can articulate the problem, the better you will be able to create a solution. So articulating the problem is really important.